My name's Mark, and you're listening to Head Straight. Hello, you lot, and welcome back. Now, today we're looking at a particular question that often comes my way, and it's this. How did I become the person that everybody comes to? Now, I don't think most people choose this role in any obvious way. It usually begins with something much smaller. Perhaps one conversation where somebody tells you something difficult, you listen without judging them, and they leave feeling calmer than they did before. Then it happens again, perhaps with the same person, or with somebody else, and gradually you become that person that people think of when they don't know who else to talk to. Now, there's something genuinely positive in that, because being able to listen well is a real quality. Not everyone can stay with somebody else's distress without interrupting, making it about themselves, or rushing to offer a quick answer. And if people experience you as calm, thoughtful and trustworthy, well, it kind of makes sense that they would come back. The difficulty is that a strength can quite easily become an expectation. Each time you reply straight away, stay awake longer than you wanted to, check in again in the morning, or make space when you're already drained, people learn something about what they can ask of you. They begin to assume that you'll probably answer, that you'll cope with whatever they bring, and that there'll always be room for one more conversation. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has deliberately taken advantage of you, and it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. The role may simply have grown through repetition until something you once chose to do becomes something that everybody expected you to keep doing. Now, I think that's really worth noticing, because there's a difference between being someone who's good at supporting people and becoming someone who no longer feels free to say, I haven't got the headspace for this tonight. Once that difference begins to disappear, the role stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like something you have to be. So now I want to think a little bit more about when their problem becomes yours, because once you've become the person people rely on, it can be difficult to know where your part in the conversation is supposed to end. The other person may have said what they needed to say, felt calmer, and gone back to whatever it was that they were doing. But you can still be left thinking about it long after the conversation is finished. You might replay in your head what they told you, wonder whether you gave the right advice, or keep checking your phone because part of you feels responsible for what happens next. Now, I don't think it's always the listening itself that becomes exhausting. Sometimes it's the belief that once somebody has brought you a problem, you're now meant to help make sure it turns out well. If they're still upset the next day, you might feel that you didn't say enough. If they ignore your advice and end up back in the same situation, you might feel really frustrated because you spent so much time trying to help them to see what seems really obvious to you. Now, that frustration makes complete sense, particularly when you've heard the same story several times and watched the same pattern repeat. But there's a question inside this that's worth thinking about. Did they ask you to solve the situation? Or have you become so used to being the helpful one that you automatically took responsibility for doing that? Now, sometimes people want advice, but sometimes they want to say something out loud, feel understood, or have somebody stay with them whilst they work out what they think. Now, these are all forms of support, but none of them need you to take ownership of the decision they make afterwards. You can still be honest. You can say when you're worried, tell somebody when you think something is unsafe, and encourage them to speak to someone who can offer more help than you can. But however much you care, you can't make another person choose differently, and you can't carry every consequence as though it belongs to you. Perhaps that's the line that becomes blurred when everyone comes to you with their problems. You start by listening, but somewhere along the way, you begin to feel as though you're responsible for steering the whole situation. And that's far heavier than simply being a good friend. And you know, when I've been discussing this with young people, this question comes up as well. Why does nobody ask how I am? Now, there can come a point when being the person everyone talks to starts to feel really lonely, because you might know a massive amount about what's happening in everyone else's life, whilst they seem to know very little about yours. You know who they're arguing with, what they're worried about, what's going wrong at home, and what they're lying awake thinking about. But when you try to remember the last time somebody properly asked how you were and stayed long enough to hear the real answer, well, you might struggle to remember that. Sometimes that's because a friendship has genuinely become one-sided. Some people get so used to receiving support that they barely notice how little they offer in return, and they might only ever appear when something has gone wrong. Now, that can be really hard because it can leave you feeling as though they value what you do for them more than they value the friendship itself, especially if they then disappear as soon as the immediate crisis has passed. But I don't think that's always the whole picture. There might also be times when people have become so used to seeing you as the person who copes that they don't realise that there's anything else to ask about. Now, maybe they do ask how you are, but you say you're fine, make a joke, or move the conversation back towards them before they've had the chance to look at it closer. Now, I can see why that might happen, because being the listener gives you a clear role. You know where to place your attention, what questions to ask, and how to be useful, whereas talking about yourself means allowing somebody else to see the parts of you that aren't calm, certain, or completely in control. You might be really good at helping other people open up, whilst feeling really awkward the moment the same attention turns towards you. Now, that doesn't excuse somebody who never shows any interest, and it doesn't mean that you should have to fight for space in every conversation. But it might explain how friendships can become unbalanced without either person making a deliberate choice for it to be that way. They get used to bringing their problems, and you get used to making room for them, until both of you begin to treat that pattern as though it's simply how the friendship works. Perhaps that's why the question, "Why does nobody ask how I am?" can be more complicated than it first sounds. Sometimes people haven't asked enough, but sometimes they might also have been given very little chance to see that there was more going on. So let me ask you this. What do you get from being needed? Now, this is probably the part of the conversation that's hardest to admit, because it's much easier to talk about how tiring the role is than to acknowledge that being needed can also feel good. There's something really powerful about knowing that people trust you, that they think of you when something matters, and that your words can help them feel calmer, clearer, or less alone. Now, that doesn't cancel out the exhaustion, and it doesn't mean that you secretly enjoy carrying everybody else's problems. It just means that the role may give you something as well as taking something from you. Being the person that people come to can give you a sense of purpose, a clear place in the group, and a feeling that you matter in a way that's easy to recognise. Now, I wonder what it would feel like if people suddenly stopped coming to you. Part of you might feel relieved, yeah, because there's fewer messages, fewer worries, and less pressure to always know what to say. But relief might not be the only feeling. You might also wonder why they've gone somewhere else, whether they still trusted you, or whether you've somehow become less important now that somebody else was helping them. Now, that reaction wouldn't make you selfish or attention-seeking, so if that's in your mind, get rid of it now. It would just show you how closely your sense of belonging may have become tied to being useful. Now, when somebody says, "You're the only person I can talk to," it can feel like a really heavy responsibility, but it can also sound like proof that you have a special place in their life. Now, there might also be something safer about connecting with people through helping them, because when there's a problem, you know what your role is. You listen, ask questions, offer reassurance, and try to help them make sense of what's happening. But when there's no crisis and nothing for you to fix, well, you might feel less certain about what you bring to the relationship. And maybe that's why stepping back can feel more unsettling than it should. You're not only giving less time or energy, you might also be testing whether people still choose you when you're no longer doing the thing that makes your place feel secure. So just to say, this isn't about judging yourself for wanting to feel important. It's absolutely normal for people to want to know that they matter to the people around them. The question is whether being needed has become the main way you prove that to yourself. Because if it has, then even the idea of helping less can begin to feel like risking the actual friendship itself. So what happens then when you try to step back? Understanding why the role matters to you is one thing, but changing it can feel much, much harder because the moment you reply later, say you haven't got the headspace or admit that you don't know what someone should do, it can feel like you're changing more than just the conversation. You might be worrying about the fact that they might think that you've become distant, that they'll feel rejected, or that they'll simply start going to somebody else instead. Now that's the exact moment when the fear of being replaced can start to creep in. Part of you might want the relief of not being everybody's first call, whilst another part of you feels unsettled by the idea that somebody else might take your place. If being helpful has become part of how you know you belong, then stepping back can feel less like protecting your energy and more like testing whether the friendship still works without that role. Now, some people might not respond well at first, especially if they've become used to having immediate access to you. They might seem annoyed, surprised, or even accuse you of being selfish. But their reaction doesn't automatically mean that you've done something wrong. Sometimes people react to a change just because the old arrangement worked really well for them. Now, I don't think the answer is to suddenly disappear or stop caring altogether, because that would only replace one extreme with another. It might be more useful to just make smaller changes, such as replying when you actually have the capacity, asking whether someone wants advice or just wants to be heard, or just being honest when you're too tired to take on another heavy conversation. The difficult part might be allowing somebody to feel disappointed without immediately rushing in to repair that feeling. If you're used to keeping other people comfortable, then their disappointment can feel like proof that you've failed them. But, and this is important, wanting more from you doesn't mean that you have more to give. And perhaps this is the real test of the relationship. Can it make room for you when you're not endlessly available, always calm, or ready with the right answer? Now, you're not going to find that out by continuing to play the role perfectly. You only begin to find out when you let the friendship adjust to a version of you who has limits as well. Okay then, Mark, here's another question. Can people value me without needing me? Good question to ask. Because there's a difference between people trusting you and people making space for you. And I think that difference matters here. Someone might trust you with things that they've never told anyone else, rely on your judgment, and believe that you'll always be there when something goes wrong. But that still doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship has made room for the parts of you that are uncertain, tired, or struggling. If most of the closeness in the friendship comes from them opening up and you helping, then the relationship might feel deep, whilst still only moving in one direction. You know they feel safe enough to be honest with you, but you might not know whether you feel safe enough to be honest with them, especially if you've become so used to being calm and capable that showing anything different feels as though it might change how they see you. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to tell people everything, because privacy is still your choice, and not every friendship needs to hold every part of your life. But there is a difference between choosing not to share and feeling as though you can't, because the moment you show need, uncertainty, or weakness, you worry that you'll no longer be the person they've come to rely on. Now, I think a stronger friendship has to be able to hold more than one side of you. It should have room for the person who listens and the person who also needs to talk, the person who gives advice and the person who doesn't know what to do, the person who shows up for others, as well as the person who sometimes hasn't got anything left to give. Now, you might only discover whether that space exists by allowing people to see something different. And that might be as small as answering honestly when somebody asks how you are, admitting that you've had a difficult day, or saying that you just don't have an answer this time. Some people might respond better than you expect, whilst others might seem uncomfortable when the relationship is no longer working in the way that they used to. Either way, you're going to learn something important. You begin to see whether people value the whole friendship or mainly the part where you make things easier for them. Because being needed can make you feel important, but feeling genuinely valued is something completely different. It means somebody still wants to be around you when you're not useful, still care about what's happening in your life when you haven't got an answer, and still see something worth holding on to when there's nothing for you to fix. Okay, Mark, so what you're saying to me is that I just need to stop caring, yeah? No. I don't think the answer to any of this is that you should stop being kind, stop listening, or becoming suspicious every time somebody comes to you with something difficult. Because being caring and trustworthy might be a genuine part of who you are. The problem starts when that care turns into something you feel trapped inside, when helping stops feeling like a choice, or when being useful becomes the main way that you know that you matter to the people around you. There's going to be times when someone really is asking too much of you, and there might be friendships where the support only seems to travel in one direction. But there might also be moments when the role is harder to step away from because it gives you something important as well. That's why changing isn't always as simple as deciding to answer a few messages or telling yourself to set better boundaries. Maybe the place to begin is by noticing what happens inside you when someone brings you another problem. Do you actually want to listen? Or do you feel as though you have to? Are you supporting them? Or have you started carrying responsibility for what they do next? Are you saying yes because you have the space? Or because saying no feels as though it might change how they see you? Now, it might also be worth noticing what happens when somebody turns the attention towards you. Whether you allow it to stay there for a moment, or whether you quickly move it away because being listened to feels much less familiar than being the listener. You don't have to tell everybody everything, but you do deserve relationships where there's room for you to be tired, uncertain, or in need of support as well. So, perhaps the next time you find yourself thinking, everybody comes to me with their problems, maybe you could ask a second question alongside it. What have I started believing that this role says about me? Because you can care deeply about other people without carrying everything that they bring you. And you can still matter to someone when there's nothing for you to solve. Now, next week, we're going to answer another problem. Are you up for it? Of course you are.